Hi everyone and happy Wednesday! So this week's video, contrary to what I typically do, started off with a bit of a plan. I say a bit of a plan because if you've been watching my channel for a while, you probably know that I typically prefer not to work with a plan. There's a plan in the sense that I know I wanted to create an abstract landscape. I also knew I wanted to work with certain colors and do a little bit of pen work, and that was about it. That was my plan. My plans always include flexibility. And I guess in that sense, that's typically why I say I don't work with a plan, because I want to be flexible and allow for things to happen as they will happen. And sometimes that also means I may have to deviate from my original plan. So flexibility is incredibly important, and it was important in this instance as well. Sometimes you also have to embrace what Bob Ross used to call happy accidents. I think in art, when you let things sort of happen as they choose to happen, in a lot of cases, it can actually create a very organic and interesting effect. And I always like to keep in mind that nothing is ever completely final in my painting process until I decide it's finished. The beauty of paint is that you can change things. You can always change things. So there we have it. Little painting that starts off with somewhat of a plan, and let's see how it goes. I hope you'll feel like joining me to either practice some of your paint skills, or if you just want to grab a cup of your favorite brew, I hope you'll sit with me and enjoy this painting process. Thank you so much for being here with me this week. I started off my process by cutting my paper to 9 by 9 inches, and I taped it to a piece of MDF hardboard. And I like to be able to do this because I want to be able to lift my paper if I feel like moving it around, or if I need to turn the paper so it's easier for me to work. I find it better than taping it to my table itself. Then I created a little bit of a ruler on the side of my tape, a very loose ruler, if you will. And I'm using some more tape to create different lines in my paper. And I'm doing this because I want to mask those areas where I am hoping to add some paint in between. And then once I remove the tape, I'll have some white paper that I can use to maybe do some pen work. The three colors I've selected for my painting are olive green, turquoise, and cinquasia maroon. They're all really beautiful colors. They're colors I love independently of each other, but I find they look especially beautiful together. So I'm going to work using these three colors in particular. I'm not going to blend them. I'm gonna apply each color individually, but what I'll do is apply them in different mixes. So I'll mix less water in the first part, like I'm doing here. I want to have a darker olive green, and so I'm putting less water in this band of the painting. And then as I go along, I'm going to create different value in this color by adding more and more water. So I can add more water to my paint by simply adding it to my palette, or when my brush is already saturated with paint, I can dip the brush in my water to get a little bit more water, and then instead of dipping it back into my paint pan, go directly onto my paper. And there's usually enough pigment on the brush for it to transfer onto the paper, but also be lighter. For the last band of olive green, I simply dipped my brush in water without rinsing it, and I didn't grab any more pigment and went straight for my paper. There was enough pigment left on my brush in order to create a lighter gradient of color. For the next color, I'm going to simply repeat the same process I did with the olive green, and I'm going to start with a more intense and pigment filled layer of color, and then I'm going to slowly but surely add more water to my pigment so that the color is more diluted as I move up. At this point, everything is dry and I've removed all the salt from my paper, and now I'm coming in with a little bit more tape because what I'm going to do is add some more pigment to certain areas of the painting to make the gradient even darker. I've let everything dry and now I'm ready to remove the tape that was on top of the painting. Often I find when I'm using tape over paint, the paint or the tape doesn't adhere to the paper quite as well as it does when it's just blank paper. And so some of the paint can seep underneath the tape. And this is one example of what I'm choosing to call a happy accident because it leaves some marks that I find can be interesting. And so I'm choosing to embrace them. And I actually really like the effect. I kind of feel like it goes very nicely with the organic feel of this painting. Now I'm adding a little bit more tape in certain areas of the painting where I want to add some iridescent paint and I want to create some thinner lines. I've not ever really created a painting like this where I used this much tape. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't do it again, not because I don't like the effect, but it's starting to feel a little bit wasteful. And I think I could have also just used my ruler, drew in some lines, and painted in between the lines, and that would have been just fine. The only thing is that it would not create that effect I was mentioning where the paint seeps underneath the tape and it kind of creates some interesting um, texture. And so, it's kind of one of those things you have to sort of weigh the value of whether or not you want to do it. But I'm happy I did it for this painting. Probably wouldn't repeat it in the future, but it is still turning out to create some different interesting effects. And so I'm happy to have done it at least once. But again, it feels a bit wasteful. So I don't think I would do this again. I could have also used some masking fluid. I do use that on occasion. I don't tend to like applying it over painted surfaces. But that's another way that I could have also masked some of the areas of the painting. Now, again, the masking fluid would adhere to the paper and the paint much more than the tape is doing, especially in those areas where there's already paint on the paper. And so you'd have very hard lines with your masking fluid. And I am really digging the effect of those little squiggly lines with the paint seeping in underneath the tape. So for a one-time effect, I'm happy to have done it and experimented with it. And I'm looking forward to adding my star gold. Darn it. I forgot to hit record when I started adding my star gold, and so I haven't recorded that section, but I did record the section where I am removing the tape and revealing the star gold over my different areas of the painting. You'll see that it seeped in underneath the tape as well and created some interesting textures. I could have really gotten bummed out by the fact that the paint seeped underneath the tape and that it created these little ridges, but I'm choosing to see it as a happy accident, and I do think it helps to contribute to the organic feel of this painting, and so I am choosing to like it. I've pulled out my ruler and pencil and I'm going to start creating some pencil lines in areas that have no paint because I want to start adding some details with my pens. I don't want to add too much because I find that the colors themselves and the textures that have been left by the salt and the paint seeping underneath the tape is adding quite a bit of interest visually. But I do want to add a few details with my pens because it'll add a little bit of value contrast and just give me a chance to practice different mark making, um, different marks. But yeah, I'm drawing in some pencil lines first just to give me some guides, and then later on, after I've added my ink, I will come in with my eraser and I'll erase those lines, leaving just the ink behind. First, I added a few little dots with my fountain pen, and now I'm using my extra fine tip black pen to create some little vertical lines in some parts of the painting. Again, I'm keeping my details very, very simple. I don't want those marks that I make with my ink to be the focal part of the painting, just a little something to draw the viewer closer. And I want the rest of the painting to be the things that stand out the most. I want the colors and the textures left by the salt to be what you mostly want to focus on. But I do like the idea of having added little details like this, and I'll repeat this in a few other sections of the painting. When I'm done adding these little dots, I'm going to use my hand drying tool to dry the ink, and then I'll remove my lines with my eraser. And unfortunately, even though I used the hand drying tool, the ink was not fully dry. And so sometimes this is where flexibility comes in. You need to also be able to use flexibility to embrace the not so happy accidents. Oh man, I was so bummed out when this happened, but I decided I was just gonna roll with it. And no, I didn't want to keep those blurred lines created by the eraser. So I decided to add some Blackberry in the painting as well. And I covered up those areas where the ink was smudged. And I think it's just gonna add a little bit more interest because this dark Blackberry paint also goes well with the other colors in the painting. And you know, it happens. Things like this happen. You're going along and your process is going relatively smoothly and you're super happy with what's on paper, and then something happens and oh, you're not so happy anymore. So it's good to be able to improvise and find solutions. And for me, the very best solution to this little issue was for me to come in with this dark paint. And I think it's going to work perfectly well. After adding the Blackberry paint, I decided that I was lacking a few little ink details in the bottom part of my painting, so I pulled out my fountain pen again, and I'm just gonna draw in some little dots just to try and balance things out a little bit more. And I think after adding these dots, that'll be it for the ink. Looking at my painting at this point, I feel like adding a little bit of magic green would also be interesting. And so I've pulled out my ruling pen and I'm going to add a few details using the ruling pen. I'll work with my ruler. Now, something to keep in mind, and I don't mind this, especially since it's already happened with the tape. When I'm using the ruling pen with my ruler, there is a chance that the paint is going to seep under the ruler and not create a very straight line. So that's important to be aware of in case you want to do this and you really don't care for those little seepages of color. I don't mind it, but if you think you may not like it, then it might be a good idea to be mindful that this is likely to happen. So just something to keep in mind. If you go in with a very small amount of paint, there's a chance it'll be okay, but you'll notice that even on the left, it seeped underneath the ruler a tiny bit. And again, I don't mind this, but just something that you might want to keep in mind. I actually have created paintings in the past where I wanted this to happen, and so I used the ruler and the ruling pen, start to apply the paint, and as I'm applying the paint, I press down on my ruler, and if there's a lot of paint near the ruler, it tends to seep underneath the ruler, and I find that it creates really interesting marks. So something worth trying if you would like to create those types of effects. And if you prefer not to create those types of effects, it's something to be mindful of. And that's it. That was exactly the final touch my painting needed, and now I'm ready to remove the tape and have a final closer look at the painting. And here we have it, a very abstract landscape created using just a few colors, and I think everything comes together really nicely. There was nothing complicated at all about creating this painting. The most important ingredient was, as I mentioned in the beginning of my process, being able to be flexible. Flexibility goes a long way, especially when the not so happy accidents happen. And I hope you can choose to be flexible in your painting processes as well. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!